Good afternoon, folks, and thank you for joining our next instalment of Series 1 of our Professional Development webinars. Today we will be talking about LGBTI young people. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands in which we're all meeting today and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the LGBTI elders, for without their strength and courage, we would not be able to do this work that we're doing here today. So as I mentioned, today's webinar is on LGBTI young people. And to present for us, we have Sally Morris, who is the coordinator of our Mind Out project, which is mental health and suicide prevention. So I will hand over to Sally. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Charlie. Thank you for everyone for joining us here today for this webinar on LGBTI young people. Throughout today's presentation, if people have any questions or queries, there's a little text box off to your left-hand side where you can type questions. So if people wish to have a question, type it there and hopefully we'll be able to answer those as we go out throughout today. I guess we felt it was really quite important to have a webinar that looked at LGBTI young people, because when we look at LGBTI young people compared to their peers and also to LGBTI adults, there actually are some specific differences related to their experiences that does really impact on their health and wellbeing quite broadly. So throughout today's webinar, we sort of want to focus on what are some of these differences for LGBTI young people, and what are some of the things you need to be aware of in your work with LGBTI young people, or in your work of designing or commissioning services to target and support LGBTI young people. When we talk about young people, it is mindful, even though we are using this acronym of LGBTI, that we are talking about a really diverse group of young people, and many may describe their identities and experiences well beyond the acronym of LGBTI. So we are talking about diverse sexualities, diverse genders, diverse bodies, diverse relationships, and that these elements all cross over, intersect as well. So you have young people who might have a diverse gender as well as having a diverse sexuality as well. And so many of the resources and research papers that look at young people often will use language more broadly than LGBTI. So they might use language like same-sex attracted or same-gender attracted, gender diverse or gender questioning. And so really throughout today's webinar, even though we will be using the language LGBTI, we are mindful that the words that young people use to describe their experiences is much, much broader, and we're trying to capture the breadth of those young people here today. And so because of that really diverse identities and experiences and behaviours within LGBTI young people, really there isn't this sense of this one-size-fits-all even within the LGBTI space, that different young people will have different needs and different experiences. So I'm going to break down through the different elements of our acronym. So starting at the beginning of the acronym with the sexuality component, looking at the LGB component, but looking at young people who aren't exclusively heterosexual. So I've got a few statistics up on the screen here to go through a bit of this. But essentially, we know that about 21% of young people report not having an exclusive heterosexual attraction. There's a range of ways that they might identify in that way, in their experience, and in that. There's about. And I think also when we're talking about LGBTI young people around their sexuality, it's important to be aware that it is during people's youth that when they are becoming aware of their sexuality. So the majority of young people are becoming aware of their sexuality by age 15, about 85%. So again, this is really important why we look at specifically at young people. It's certainly a time in people's lives when there's a significant amount of identity development happening and exploration happening. Although it is also really important that even though there are a number of young people who have same-sex attraction or same-gender attraction, their behaviour might still be different, and they might be still exclusively engaging in heterosexual sexual relationships. So there's not always an alignment between young people's sexual feelings and their sexual behaviours. And it is important to note that young people choose their identities and their behaviours for a really diverse range of reasons, including social approval. And so consequently, sexual behaviour or sexual identity does not always align with attraction. I've got some quotes throughout today's webinar just to really, I guess, ground the theory into what is the lived experience of young people. So here's a quote from Tristan, who's 18, and they say, "I spent a large portion of my teenage years denying and attempting to change my sexuality, but I've grown to understand and accept my sexuality more, especially after revealing myself to my family and friends. I feel less anxious now, and there is a sense of isolation, and sometimes I feel very naked, although I wasn't being really me, until my friends and family knew I was gay. They said it was almost as like I was playing a game in which I was a spy and it had a secret that no one knew about. And if I had to act in very particular ways so they wouldn't find out, I would keep my distance from them. But now it can seem a little too real and it's frightening." So there's I guess Tristan's really talking about that experience of having to hide their sexuality from their family and friends. And another quote from Ray, 17. "I'm not actually sure when or how I realised I was pansexual, actually. I suspected I was bisexual since I was 12. Pansexuality for me is not based on my romantic or sexual attraction on gender or sex. There are many other characteristics that prevail in importance, such as physical attraction, spiritual connection, intelligence, cultural similarities, which decide whether I begin a romantic or sexual relationship with someone. Gender and sex doesn't matter. If I'm attracted to someone, it's not going to stop me if they're a certain gender or possess a certain genitalia." So I think that's what we're certainly finding with younger people is they're exploring and experiencing their sexuality much, much more broadly than we might have historically, and it's not bound by gender or these solid constructs of gender and sex. Moving on to gender, when we're talking about diverse gender, it's the National Survey of Australian Secondary School Students have, in 2013, they allowed young people to describe their gender more broadly than male and female. And what they have noticed is that they have an increasing number of young people who are describing their gender more broadly than male and female when they give the opportunity to do so. And certainly within our LGBTI cohort of young people, we know that there is a growing number of young people who are also describing their gender other than male or female. And we also know that a significant portion of trans and gender diverse young people use pronouns that are gender neutral. So they're not using she, her, hers, or he, his, him pronouns. They're choosing to use pronouns such as they, their, or them, or other gender neutral pronouns that don't indicate someone as male or female. Similar to sexuality, the exploration and realisation of gender is something that happens at a very young age, with 14 being the average age that people began sort of questioning their gender. And so a huge proportion, 32%, reported that they have always questioned their gender identity, that they have not been satisfied with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Also, quite interestingly enough, and this is the intersection between gender and sexuality, certainly of young people with diverse genders, there's a significant portion of young people with diverse genders who identify with sexualities that aren't purely defined by gender. So they're not identifying as heterosexual or gay or lesbian, which are sexualities that are defined by the gender of the partner that you're with. They're defining their sexualities much, much more broadly, and in ways that isn't restricted by the gender of the partner. So I think that's actually quite interesting, the crossover there between diverse sexuality and diverse gender, and there's a significant crossover between these spaces. For our trans and gender diverse young people, there's some extra layers of complexities that impact on them as well. And within Australia, the Family Court of Australia is responsible for making decisions on access to medical treatment for trans young people under the age of 18. So for young people, this is a particularly pertinent structure system that gets in the way for them. In Australia, there is a medication we colloquially called puberty blockers, which can be prescribed by a doctor to actually delay puberty if both the parents and the medical team agree that that's the best course of action for a trans young person. For a trans young person to go through experience puberty that doesn't align with their gender can be quite an extremely traumatic experience for a young person. So puberty blockers can be an option to support that young person to go through their teenage years without that extra complexity of puberty. However, if there is disagreement between parents and medical teams, the family court will make a decision. However, court involvement is actually mandatory before the prescription of hormones or surgical interventions for trans young people under the age of 18. And this is because this is due to the long-term impacts that hormones and surgical interventions have on a young person. But it's actually quite unusual situation, as you can imagine, to have a court system make medical decisions for a young person. And even if there isn't a dispute between parents, medical team and the young person, the court still needs to decide whether the child is competent enough to provide their own consent. So I guess it's important for people to be aware of these extra complexities that trans young people and gender diverse young people need to negotiate, that sexually diverse young people don't necessarily need to negotiate, and also their non-trans peers need to negotiate as well. So here's a couple of quotes from young people around their gender identity. This is Bailey, who's 16, and they say, teachers at schools still call me a girl and say things like good girl. I don't understand which part of me telling them I'm not a girl, and all I want to shout out is to them that I'm not a girl. The school principal said he would never call me a male or use male pronouns until I've had my gender reassignment therapy done, which will never happen until I've left school. I have to wait to be assessed by the gender clinic at the Royal Children's Hospital, which doesn't ever seem to be in progress. Then the school will look at the assessment and decide if they let me wear guys' trousers to school or not. I want it to happen right now, and it makes me depressed so much of the time that I can't focus on school. And here's a quote from Charlie, age 20. My gender identity I would describe as genderqueer. That is to say, I've never saw myself as a girl, which is my birth sex, but I couldn't see myself as a boy. I use the word genderqueer because transgender often doesn't fit, and I don't want to stick to one side in regards to gender. But before not knowing that was a thing, I tried to identify as a girl. I think my gender is important to me because it dictates a lot in my life. I tend to perform like a female, but the struggle to maintain this for social reasons is really challenging. I choose to hide my identity because I fear abuse, and my family has told me it's okay to be a lesbian as long as you don't act like a man. The fear of discrimination is used to make me feel like I was wrong, and maybe it still does. So these stories of young people really highlight the differences between same-sex attraction and diverse sexuality and diverse gender, and the different challenges that trans and gender diverse young people encounter compared to their peers. Moving on to the end of our acronym, the I for Intersex, which is around people with diverse bodies. And it's important to remember that 1.7% of the population have an intersex variation. And for the majority of people, about 65% of people with intersex variations, they actually learn about these variations before the age of 18. And they usually are told by doctors or parents that they have an intersex variation. And again, about 60% of people with intersex variations have experienced medical intervention. So this could be surgery or hormones or therapy around the intersex variation. But the majority of these have been experienced by people under the age of 18. So again, for young people with intersex variations, childhood and adolescence are particular pertinent times in their life where they're experiencing medical interventions, or they're learning about their bodies, that they and the shame and stigma that is given to them from the systems around them about that. And here's a couple of quotes from some young people with intersex variations. This is Dany, who's 16. I left school when I left home, and now I couch surf or live in my car. I've never had support from my family. We just fought all the time over my body and what they let happen to it and how they wanted me to act. They wanted me to be the perfect, quiet little girl, and they got me, and I can't help that. And I feel really angry and lost right now. So even though Dany has quite a distressing story, I also wanted to share one from Alex, who is a young person with intersex variation who's recently more publicly talking about their experiences in the last couple of months. So I thought I'd share a little bit of their story, which is a little bit different. Alex says, I started puberty a bit late, and I went to a doctor and he ran some tests. He told me that I had high level of testosterone that caused some issues with the way my uterus worked, and introduced me to the term intersex. I was really lucky that my first interaction with the medical system and with intersex traits was really a positive one, and with a well-educated doctor. He was honest with me and used the right terminology, and that gave me the option of embracing my identity and connecting me with other intersex people, which made a huge difference. So again, in Alex's story, we can see that adolescence is a time when young people are going through puberty, and these are the times when they might notice or realise things about their bodies might be different to what they might be expecting to occur. So I guess for all young people within the LGBTI spectrum, childhood and youth and adolescence are really particular, pertinent times in their life, around identity development and their experiences. And as I touched on a little bit earlier, it is really important when we're talking about LGBTI young people that this is also a time when there might be quite a significant difference between the identities, the words young people use to describe themselves, their gender and their sexuality and their body, that might be quite different to their behaviours, that the sexual behaviours or the gender behaviours that someone's engaging in, which again might be quite different to their internal thoughts and feelings about who they are or who they want to be. And that often there is quite an incongruence between these three different elements for LGBTI young people as they're still really exploring who they are and where they fit in the world and developing their identities. So really, as I was just touching on there, LGBTI young people are really in the middle of this process of exploring and forming and developing their identities. But certainly we do know that the social impact, the social environment has quite a significant impact on young people's experiences of their realizations, and whether a space around them is supportive or not really impacts on their ability to explore their feelings, put words to their feelings, and to express themselves in the way that they wish. And I will touch on shortly about some of those social environments, specifically how that impacts on young people. But I think it's really important that young people generally are going through lots of developmental stages, and certainly for LGBTI young people, there's an extra challenge of going through development stages around their body and their gender and their sexuality, and that's really, really, really influenced by the world around them, the social environment around them. So here's a couple of quotes also just about identity formation. So this is Ashley, who's 17. I'm not really sure what my gender is yet. I'm physically female, but I'm not sure mentally. I feel most comfortable in guys' clothing, and when I'm treated like a guy, but I still wouldn't just find myself as transgender, not yet anyway. So it really shows that young people are still really in that process of figuring out where they fit and who they are. And here's a reflection from Mitchell, who's 21. Lots of gay youth, myself included, realised they had a same-sex attracted feelings retrospectively. In grade 5, I could say that my behaviour was certainly reflective of my sexuality, but I wouldn't have been able to realise it at the time. Attribution of my own sexuality for me was ongoing and a fluid process. While I could say no now that I always knew, certainly as a 5-year-old, I didn't understand what my behaviour and thoughts meant. And here's a quote from Giana, who's 17, around her intersex variation. I had pressure from my family, counsellor and doctors to be more feminine, to catch the boys, and to make myself more fully a woman by removing my testes. They tried to correct my body and behaviour, but now I'm embracing it. So for all young people within the LGBTI spectrum, there's lots of processes happening around identity formation for them. And I guess generally we have the conversation, and I think this has been sorry, an interesting reflection for myself. I've been working in the LGBTI space for quite a few number of years, and started working with LGBTI young people specifically, and to notice how our culture and community and society has been changing over time. And certainly compared to older LGBTI people, we can say that LGBTI young people are exploring their identities at a time when certainly discrimination is on the decline. We have more access to role models, we have more access to information, there's more legal protections, there's more visibility about LGBTI people. However, despite this shift, and with that shift, we might conclude that things are okay and therefore LGBTI young people should be okay. But we actually know that LGBTI people's wellbeing actually improves with age. And actually it is our LGBTI young people who actually have the poorest mental health outcomes across all age groups within the LGBTI community. So again, this is a particularly impertinent reason to focus on LGBTI young people specifically. I just want to also give a bit of an example of what is it like to be the experiences of being LGBTI young people in our current climate. So I've got a couple of images up on the screen here, and I guess what I really wanted to demonstrate was the contrast between significant negative messages about LGBTI young people, for example, about whether sexuality or gender diversity should be topics that should be discussed with young people within schools. And when these conversations have happened or are proposed to happen, the reaction from the community about that. On one hand, we have this really minimisation of the value of LGBTI young people. And on the other hand, we have a rise of LGBTI young people being really visible and active in our community. And I've got an example there of Troy Sivan, who's a gay young man who is a singer, and he came to popularity on YouTube, and he's on the cover of Rolling Stone. He's actually also just been nominated for Australian Young Person of the Year this year. So on the other hand, we've got this real conflicting contrast between visibility and role models and stigma and discrimination on the other hand. And also, I guess, with this contrast, young people now have access with the internet and social media, are able to access information and resources and community in significantly different ways than has ever been available. And young people significantly use the internet to connect with people. But again, the internet can be a place, and social media can be a place where you can't only just see one side of the story. So even say if you're reading an article about Troy in Rolling Stone on Facebook, undoubtedly there would be a series of negative stigmatizing messages posted underneath that story about gay young people or gay people in general. So it's actually very difficult for young people to only access purely positive stories. They're constantly exposed to this conflicting message of support and stigma at the same time. So negotiating those messages, knowing which ones are real, which ones do you believe, which ones do you engage in, is a constant process of negotiating that. So here's some statistics, to put those experiences into facts. And this is from the Writing Themselves In 3 survey, which is Writing Themselves In has been a series of research papers over a number of years, and have been tracking the experiences of same-sex attracted and gender diverse young people. And certainly they've been able to show that still a significant portion of LGBT young people are still experiencing verbal abuse. Like 60% are experiencing verbal abuse. A large number is still experiencing physical abuse that's related to their sexuality or gender. And certainly majority of young people are experiencing more subtle forms of homophobia, such as exclusion, rumours and humiliation. And certainly we do know within that our trans and gender diverse young people are particularly vulnerable, as are actually young men as well, and they're much more likely to experience abuse. Oh, sorry, my slide hasn't actually come up terribly well on the screen here, but what this graph is trying to demonstrate is the different experiences. What is the impact of these experiences of stigma on the mental health and wellbeing of LGBT young people? So I'm going to go through these because it hasn't come up correctly. So on the left, we've got the mental health diagnosis. The blue column represents LGBT young people, and the green column represents all young people in an Australian context. So we know that about 47% of LGBT young people have been diagnosed with a mental health disorder, and that's compared to about 26% of the general population of the same age. About 33% of LGBTI young people have engaged in self-harm, compared to about 11% of the general population. And also on my printouts, my statistics have been a bit blurred out as well. So I can't actually give you, I'll post up the slides on the PHN webpage so you can see the actual statistics. So I'm terribly sorry that I can't give them to you right now. But generally what we can see across here, that when we talk about mental health disorder diagnosis, self-harm, suicide ideation and suicide attempts, that LGBTI young people have a significantly higher representation than their peers of the same age. And certainly there's other health outcomes for LGBTI young people that are quite and particularly related and tied to experiences of stigma, discrimination and abuse. We know that LGBTI young people have higher use of drugs and alcohol than their peers of their same age. And again, we know that young people who experience abuse and homophobia and stigma are actually more likely to be using drugs and alcohol, and they usually use it as a coping strategy, as a mechanism to deal with feelings that are arising from experiences of stigma. We also know that LGBTI young people are sexually active earlier, and they're actually more likely to experience all types of sexual activity, and consequently have higher risk of STIs. Also, interestingly, LGBTI young people are still actually have higher risks of pregnancy. So there's not always the alignment between sexual behaviour and identity. So LGBTI young people will be still engaging in sexual behaviour that doesn't align with their sexual identity. And so that's really quite important, I guess, around education information that's available to LGBTI young people. And we also know from what young people tell us is that the majority of the information around sexual health, usually within the school system, but also provided by family, isn't usually inclusive of behaviours that they might be wanting to engage or are engaging in. So not relevant to same-sex attracted young people or gender diverse young people, or inclusive of people with intersex bodies. We also know that LGBTI young people are overrepresented in homelessness populations, and I'll touch on briefly about why that might be. But again, that's something that's for PHN to be particularly pertinent to be mindful of. That where are the spaces where you might be more likely to see LGBTI young people, or where are the spaces where LGBTI young people might have a different experience than their peers. So just to touch on, I guess, the experiences of families, and this is tied somewhat to the high rates of homelessness for LGBTI young people. We know from what young people tell us that even though there is greater acceptance of LGBTI young people, that disclosure to parents around their sexuality or gender identity is still a significantly traumatic event for young people. because so much rests on those child-parent relationships, and it's not only emotional support that is at risk of losing emotional support, but for young people, most of them are still living at home with their families, so it's actually still the resources that young people need to sustain themselves, so food, accommodation, income. So not only emotional support, but physical support. Interestingly, of the young LGBTI young people who experience abuse, about a quarter of those actually experience that abuse at home, with parents often being the perpetrators of that abuse in the home. So for young people who are often very reliant on their families, I guess as LGBTI people get older, they gain more independence away from families and don't have the same level of reliance. So for LGBTI young people, families is a particular space that provides both challenges and support at the same time. Another space for LGBTI young people, which is different to older LGBTI people, is their engagement with school. And for many young people, school is a space in which they are required to engage in. But within the school space, there's very little information support targeting LGBTI young people. Schools are also very gendered environments for LGBTI young people, so in what they wear, so what uniforms you wear, what activities you do, which bathrooms you use, is all based on your gender. And often there's very little autonomy or choice about exploring your gender or experiencing your gender in a more diverse way. And there was that quote a little bit earlier from a young person about wanting to wear a particular uniform, but the school wasn't allowing them to do so. Also, when we're looking at young people's experiences of abuse, actually school was the most likely place where young people experience abuse. So 80% of LGBT young people who were abused experienced that abuse at school. And what we hear from young people's experiences within the school space is actually there's often a lack of response to abuse from teachers, that often homophobia or transphobia isn't seen as the same level, isn't given the same level of importance as other forms of bullying and harassment in the school. And certainly from what we hear from young people is that these experiences of abuse and stigma and discrimination within the school environment has a really significant impact on their schooling, so much so that some young people will disengage from school completely, which has impacts on future employment or other future education opportunities as well. So as we sort of near towards the end of the content here for you today, I'm going to be going through some of the things that LGBTI young people benefit from. But as I move to this space, I'd like to encourage people who are watching, if you have any questions or queries, to type the message in the chat box, which is in the lower left-hand side of your screen. So I guess as we've been going through what are the experiences of LGBTI young people and really looking at LGBTI young people when comparing them to their peers of the same age, but also looking at comparing LGBTI young people compared to their older counterparts. We know that LGBTI young people really benefit from spaces and places that they feel safe and supported, where they can explore their identities, gain access to information, talk to their peers, talk about their experiences, go learn about different perspectives and learn about different identities. And that can be really helpful to support young people through the process of identity formation, to answer that question, who am I and where do I fit in the world? And so having a space that allows them and supports them to do that is really important. And whether this happens in the same space or in other spaces, but certainly feeling connected with their peers, despite the growing awareness of LGBTI people within our broader community, many LGBTI people will still have that feeling of intense isolation, although I am the only one experiencing what I'm experiencing. So the opportunity for young people to connect with their peers who will also be exploring their sexuality, exploring their bodies and exploring their genders and exploring relationships is a really useful support strategy for them to feel as though they're not alone. We also know that LGBTI young people really benefit from flexible engagement and communication methods. LGBTI young people use the internet significantly. So they're using social media sites, they're using YouTube to both share their stories with other young people, but also to hear the stories and experiences of other young people about where do I fit in the world, and to find other people who are like them. And for many young people who might be hesitant or unsure about engaging with services, accessing information support in online spaces is a really important strategy for young people to connect with the types of information that they need to access. So certainly, and a number of our research papers have looked at how LGBTI young people use the internet and online spaces, and it certainly is a space where they're engaging. And certainly for also young people who might be in rural regional areas where there might not be that local LGBTI youth group that they can go to and meet other young people. If people are physically isolated and don't have local supports, online becomes their community and becomes the space where they can connect with their peers in really meaningful ways. Young people also really benefit from just access to words, language and frameworks. As one of the quotes earlier, there was a young person who reflected about, in hindsight, I knew I could see what this was, but at the time I didn't have the words to describe what my experience was. And certainly that's been a story we hear again and again from young people about when I learnt about gender diversity, when I learnt about trans, when I found out what intersex was, that's when I knew that that's what was happening for me. So giving young people access to those words and frameworks and knowledge really benefit their sense of connectedness and the sense that they're a part of something bigger. And in these spaces, as young people are really exploring their identities, figuring out who they are and where they fit in the world, young people really do benefit from those supportive spaces to really openly discuss their issues and experiences, but also to do so without any expectations or without any judgments about what they're experiencing. There's sometimes a sense of that if you're gay or lesbian, bi or trans, that you should just know. But actually it is this process. It is a process of identity development, and to have that space to query and to question and to reflect and to ponder. And to figure out, well, who am I, is really important to their well-being. We also know that our trans and gender diverse young people really do benefit from access to specialist service providers who have expertise in gender and gender diversity, especially if young people are wishing to engage in physical transition or to access puberty blockers or change their body in some way to reflect their gender identity. They really need access to professionals that have quality knowledge in that space. And we also know that can be difficult to find in some locations, but it is really important to know that just not any psychologist or psychiatrist or GP will often have sufficient knowledge about trans and gender diversity. So it is a bit a niche area of knowledge, and often our trans young people will need support to find those professionals and to connect to them. And also, I guess the flip side of that is that many of our health professionals need additional support to gain knowledge and confidence and skills in working with trans and gender diverse young people as well. So it's sort of a bit there, two sides of the coin. And also when we're talking about intersex, young people with intersex variations, there's a significant movement in that space about self-determination and bodily autonomy, that young people with intersex variations should be able to make decisions about their own body themselves, especially if they're given proposal of accessing surgery or using hormones, which is, and around the teenagehood is when it appears that a lot of that process happens. So for young people with intersex variations to be able to make their own decisions about their bodies and their well-being, and to be given sufficient information about how do I make these decisions. So what are the side effects, what are the consequences of this intervention, and not just short-term consequences, but also long-term consequences. Many people with intersex variations who've experienced medical intervention will often talk about the long-term consequences of those interventions, and often talk about if they had known about those consequences, they wouldn't have given consent for those processes to happen. So that's pretty much the content we've got here for today's webinar. So just as we're coming to the end, I just want to check to see if anyone had any questions around LGBTI young people. We will be placing a recording of this webinar up on the PHN page of the National LGBTI Health Alliance, and we also will upload some additional resources that are specific to LGBTI young people. But certainly encourage PHNs to specifically think about LGBTI young people when designing and commissioning services. Again, how young people might be different, have different needs and experiences to their peers of the same age, but also how LGBTI young people will have different needs and experiences to older LGBTI young people who generally will have access to more resources, would have had more time to develop more resilience, have developed more support networks, and have gained independence from family and schooling and environments. So thank you for everyone who's participated today. I haven't had any questions come through, so so thank you for everyone for participating. And yes, thank you. Thanks very much.